The rust bucket drifted through the endless darkness between the stars like a relic that had somehow refused to die. By every civilized standard in the galaxy, it was an embarrassment. Its scarred hull was stitched together with mismatched armor plates salvaged from dozens of forgotten wrecks. One engine had once belonged to an industrial mining barge, another had been stripped from a decommissioned patrol frigate, and the third was an experimental prototype that nobody aboard could quite remember where they had stolen, borrowed, as Captain Leo Maddox preferred to call it. Every time the engines powered up, the entire ship groaned with metallic protests, as though it was personally offended that it had survived yet another day. It was ugly, noisy, and spectacularly unreliable, but despite all logic and engineering principles, the old ship kept flying. To the governments scattered across known space, the rust bucket was nothing more than worthless scrap drifting from one forgotten sector to another. To the 5 people who called it home, however, it was the closest thing they had ever found to a family. Far beyond the prosperous trade worlds and glittering capitals of civilized space, entire civilizations lived beneath a shadow so immense that even mentioning its name was enough to silence crowded rooms. Pirates feared it, mercenary fleets avoided it, politicians surrendered before it arrived. That shadow belonged to the Vrykul Directorate. Unlike the great empires of history, the Vrykul had never built their dominance through glorious battles or endless invasions. War was inefficient. It destroyed valuable infrastructure, consumed resources, and inspired resistance. The Vrykul considered emotions to be flaws in strategic thinking. Every civilization, they believed, could be reduced to predictable mathematical patterns. Every government could be analyzed. Every rebellion could be calculated long before the first shot was ever fired. Their empire was not built on hatred. It was built on certainty. When frontier systems began dreaming about independence, the Vrykul rarely bothered sending armies. Instead, enormous black machines appeared silently in orbit. Trade routes vanished overnight. Communication satellites stopped responding. Defense networks mysteriously shut themselves down. Entire planetary economies collapsed within days without a single bomb ever falling from the sky. Governments that had once promised freedom suddenly found themselves completely isolated, unable to coordinate even the simplest response. Resistance didn't fail because it was defeated. It failed because it was quietly suffocated before it could even begin. Behind every one of those terrifying operations stood a machine so infamous that its name had become a warning whispered from one generation to the next. The Aethelguard. Officially designated as the Sovereign Planetary Containment Array, the Aethelguard wasn't simply a warship. It was an automated fortress the size of a small moon, surrounded by countless drone carriers, orbital factories, gravity projectors, electronic warfare arrays, and autonomous defense fleets. It required no admirals, no generals, and no living crew. A central artificial intelligence analyzed billions of tactical possibilities every second, selecting whichever strategy guaranteed absolute compliance while wasting the fewest possible resources. Entire civilizations had surrendered after merely detecting its approach on long-range sensors. No government had ever escaped once the Aethelguard arrived in orbit. Even among the Vrykul themselves, very few knew how the colossal machine truly functioned. Rumors spread through military circles about a mysterious central ignition core buried somewhere deep inside its armored heart. Some believed it contained compressed stellar plasma harvested from dying suns. Others whispered that it was powered by an artificially stabilized singularity capable of producing limitless energy. Whatever the truth was, the Directorate guarded that secret more fiercely than any treasure in the galaxy. Countless intelligence agencies had spent decades trying to uncover even the smallest detail about the core. None had succeeded. Hundreds of light years away from politics, empires, and impossible superweapons, Captain Leo, Jax, Maddox was hanging upside down inside a cramped maintenance shaft, repeatedly hitting a stubborn coolant valve with an oversized wrench. "Come on," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You've survived pirate attacks, reactor leaks, and Steve's wiring experiments. Don't choose today to give up." The valve answered by exploding with a blast of superheated steam directly into his face. Leo squeezed his eyes shut and sighed. Fair enough. I probably deserved that. His communicator crackled almost immediately. You talking to the ship again? Came an amused voice through the speaker. Leo grinned despite the burn on his cheek. She appreciates encouragement. No, the voice replied. She's actively trying to kill you. That's just her way of saying she cares. The woman on the other end laughed. Her name was Mara Quinn, and without exaggeration, she was the only reason the Rust Bucket still possessed functioning engines. Years earlier, Mara had been one of humanity's brightest propulsion engineers. Fresh out of the Colonial Engineering Academy, she designed emergency reactor stabilization systems that saved thousands of civilian lives during one of the worst solar flare disasters in recorded history. Her supervisors congratulated her publicly, accepted awards for her work, and quietly erased her name from every official report. When Mara exposed the corruption, the same officials buried her career beneath fabricated disciplinary investigations. Within months she found herself blacklisted across every major engineering firm in human space. No corporation would hire her. No government would even answer her applications. After spending years trying to rebuild a career that powerful people had destroyed out of pure greed, she finally gave up. Salvaging abandoned wrecks alongside criminals and outcasts, she discovered, was strangely more honest than working for respectable corporations had ever been. Leo pulled himself out of the maintenance shaft and floated down the narrow corridor toward the bridge, brushing grease from his already stained flight jacket. He had once imagined himself flying humanity's fastest reconnaissance craft across unexplored frontiers, discovering worlds no one had ever seen before. Growing up on a lonely colony at the edge of human territory, he spent countless nights staring through an old telescope rebuilt by his father, dreaming about the stars beyond the horizon. Those dreams carried him into the Human Frontier Recon Corps, where he quickly became one of its finest long-range scout pilots. His career should have lasted decades. Instead, it ended during a single mission. Ordered to abandon several civilian refugee transports trapped inside an active combat zone, Leo ignored direct commands and escorted the defenseless ships to safety. Every civilian survived. Military headquarters responded by stripping away his medals, destroying his reputation, and dishonorably discharging him for insubordination. The people he had saved remembered him as a hero. Official history remembered him as a reckless officer who disobeyed orders. Unable to find honest work after leaving the service, he drifted into the dangerous world of deep space salvage, where broken ships often held fortunes for those brave enough to retrieve them. Along the way, he found something he had never expected. He found people who understood exactly what it meant to lose everything. Steve Holloway barely looked up from the sensor console as Leo entered the bridge. So, Steve asked casually, did the engine explode this time? Not today. Steve nodded thoughtfully. Excellent. I'll move tomorrow's explosion into the calendar. Steve had once been one of humanity's most respected cybersecurity specialists, hired by the wealthiest corporations to test their supposedly impenetrable computer networks. Unfortunately, he proved just how vulnerable those corporations really were. When executives began secretly using his skills for industrial espionage against competitors, Steve refused to participate. They repaid his integrity by fabricating evidence that made him appear responsible for the crimes he had exposed. Overnight, every database identified him as one of the galaxy's most wanted cybercriminals. Unable to clear his name, he vanished into the frontier, where hacking abandoned satellites paid considerably better than prison. Across the bridge sat Dr. Evelyn Reyes, carefully examining glowing biological samples collected from an alien ecosystem growing inside an ancient wreck. She glanced over her shoulder. Coolant pressure stable? For now. Shame. Leo frowned. You were hoping I'd fail? No, Evelyn replied with a perfectly straight face. I simply lost 5 credits betting that the engine would explode before lunch. Laughter echoed through the bridge. Evelyn hadn't always been a scavenger either. Once regarded as one of humanity's leading xenobiologists, She devoted her life to protecting newly discovered alien ecosystems from corporate exploitation. When powerful mining companies demanded that she falsify environmental reports approving illegal colony expansion, she refused. Her research grants disappeared almost overnight. Lawsuits followed. Within a year, one of humanity's greatest scientific minds found herself unemployed because she valued truth more than profit. The final member of the crew arrived carrying an engine component nearly the size of Mara herself. "I found the stabilizer," Owen Briggs announced proudly. Leo blinked. "It was missing? It fell off yesterday. And nobody mentioned this?" Owen shrugged. "You looked busy." For 20 years, Owen had worked deep inside asteroid mining operations until automated extraction drones replaced nearly every human laborer. Thousands lost their jobs. Owen simply stole one of the mining rigs and disappeared before security could stop him. He wasn't driven by revenge. He genuinely believed machines lacked the creativity needed to do the job properly. If something broke, Owen could repair it. If it couldn't be repaired, he'd somehow convince reality otherwise. Life aboard the Rust Bucket was far from glamorous. Breakfast usually consisted of recycled protein paste disguised beneath increasingly creative spices. Fuel shortages were so common that arguments about engine efficiency had practically become a daily tradition. Half the equipment aboard carried bright warning labels advising immediate replacement. The crew simply crossed those warnings out with permanent marker and kept using everything anyway. Yet beneath the endless sarcasm, improvised repairs, and constant near disasters, something genuine had quietly formed between 5 people the rest of civilization had thrown away. They trusted one another, not because they were perfect, because they had survived together. And out in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, that kind of trust was worth far more than money. None of them realized that before the day was over, a single intercepted signal would transform their next routine salvage mission into the most impossible theft in galactic history. The following morning, the Rust Bucket glided deeper into the forgotten battlefield, its worn engines pushing the patched-together salvage ship through a maze of shattered asteroids and drifting warships. The battle that had created this graveyard had ended more than 60 years earlier, yet its scars remained frozen in the vacuum of space. Massive Vrykul cruisers drifted silently beside broken human destroyers, while the skeletal remains of automated drone carriers slowly rotated through the darkness like enormous metallic ghosts. There was no sound beyond the steady vibration of the Rust Bucket's engines, but every twisted hull and every fractured armor plate told the story of a war that had once shaken entire sectors of the galaxy. Most people saw tragedy when they looked upon such places. Leo Maddox saw opportunity. Battlefields like these had become his livelihood, and the forgotten wrecks often contained enough valuable technology to keep the crew fed for months. The Rust Bucket eased toward a heavily damaged Vrykul escort frigate that had become lodged between 2 giant asteroids. Although the vessel had clearly suffered catastrophic damage during the battle, much of its outer armor remained intact. More importantly, its reactor compartment appeared untouched, making it an excellent candidate for salvage. Leo smiled as he studied the ancient vessel through the cockpit glass and remarked that the Directorate certainly knew how to build ships that refused to fall apart. Mara, who had already begun examining the frigate's structural scans, answered with the dry confidence that everyone aboard had come to expect from her. The Vrykul, she reminded him, designed everything to survive wars, but even the strongest machines eventually became scrap if enough time passed. Within minutes, magnetic docking cables connected the 2 ships, and Mara and Owen crossed into the abandoned frigate wearing reinforced salvage suits. It was a routine operation, one they had performed hundreds of times before. Every movement reflected years of experience. Owen focused on removing heavy mechanical components while Mara carefully inspected reactors, power conduits, and navigation systems for anything that could still be restored. Meanwhile, Leo remained aboard the Rust Bucket, supervising the operation while Steve monitored sensors and Dr. Evelyn Reyes cataloged several unusual biological samples collected during their previous expedition. The interior of the Vrykul frigate felt strangely preserved despite the decades that had passed. Emergency lighting flickered weakly along cracked corridors, casting long shadows across floating debris. Thick layers of dust coated the walls, interrupted only by the occasional scorch mark where kinetic rounds had punched through the armored hull. Here and there, fragments of ancient maintenance drones floated lifelessly through the corridors, their power cells exhausted long ago. It was as though the ship itself had simply stopped existing in the middle of its final battle and had waited patiently ever since for someone to discover it. Owen quickly found himself admiring the quality of the engineering hidden beneath the damaged hull. Although he had spent years dismantling Vrykul technology, he could never completely hide his respect for the precision with which it had been built. Every component fit perfectly into place. Every cable followed mathematical symmetry. Even after 6 decades of neglect, many of the ship's internal mechanisms remained remarkably intact. Mara, however, was far less sentimental. She reminded him over the communicator that admiration would not pay for fuel, and that every minute they spent appreciating Vrykul craftsmanship was another minute someone else could stumble across the same salvage site. Back aboard the Rust Bucket, Steve passed the time scanning the surrounding sector for signs of other scavengers. The battlefield appeared almost completely deserted. Only the weak signals of ancient distress beacons drifted through the background radiation, joining countless natural electromagnetic emissions that filled interstellar space. It was the sort of peaceful routine every salvager hoped for. Quiet jobs were profitable jobs. Then one of the auxiliary receivers briefly detected something that should not have existed. The signal lasted less than a second before disappearing beneath the constant wash of cosmic interference. Under normal circumstances, the ship's computer would have dismissed it as random background noise, but Steve had spent years teaching himself to notice exactly the kinds of irregularities that everyone else ignored. He replayed the recording several times before narrowing his eyes. There was a rhythm hidden beneath the interference. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakably artificial. Curiosity immediately replaced routine. Steve redirected additional processing power toward the receiver and began stripping away layers of background radiation one frequency at a time. Another pulse appeared a few moments later. Then another. Each burst was extraordinarily short and heavily compressed, almost as though whoever had transmitted it expected nobody outside a carefully selected network to even notice it existed. Leo noticed Steve's sudden silence and wandered over from the cockpit. Years of working together had taught him that Steve only became this focused when something truly unusual appeared on his screens. Looking at the data himself revealed nothing more than a handful of distorted spikes buried within ordinary sensor noise, but Steve's expression suggested otherwise. Without taking his eyes off the display, Steve quietly explained that the transmission was using encryption protocols unlike anything employed by civilian governments or commercial corporations. Every burst changed frequencies almost instantly while simultaneously rewriting its own authentication sequence, making conventional interception practically impossible. Whoever had designed the system had expected sophisticated espionage attempts and had built accordingly. Leo frowned. Military communications were uncommon in frontier space, but not impossible. However, something about Steve's tone suggested this was different. The longer Steve analyzed the transmission, the more unsettled he became. Instead of attacking the encryption directly, he began studying the transmission itself. Power output, timing intervals, synchronization patterns, directional alignment, and packet size all revealed tiny pieces of information. Individually they meant very little. Together they formed a surprisingly detailed picture. Nearly half an hour passed before Steve finally leaned back and let out a slow breath. The signal, he explained, was not coming from another ship. It was originating inside the wreck they were salvaging. That announcement immediately transformed an ordinary salvage operation into something far more unsettling. Mara stopped dismantling the reactor assembly and began searching the surrounding compartments for any active communication equipment. Everything she found appeared hopelessly dead. Power conduits had long since failed. Control stations were cold. Antennas had been destroyed during the battle. Nothing aboard the frigate should have possessed enough energy to transmit anything across interstellar distances. Steve continued tracing the signal until he isolated its source. Hidden deep within the damaged communications array remained an emergency synchronization relay, a tiny autonomous system powered by an independent long-duration energy cell designed to survive even catastrophic destruction. Somehow, against all expectations, that forgotten relay had continued functioning for more than 60 years. The discovery raised far more questions than answers. Why would the Vrykul leave an emergency relay active for decades? Why had no recovery fleet ever returned to deactivate it? Most importantly, who was still communicating with it? Steve expanded his analysis and compared the relay's authentication patterns against fragments of military databases he had memorized years earlier. Several sequences looked disturbingly familiar. He checked them again, convinced he had made a mistake. He had not. When he finally spoke, his voice was noticeably quieter than before. The relay, he explained, was communicating directly with the Vrykul Directorate's highest-level military network. The bridge fell silent. Even after years spent living beyond civilized space, everyone aboard understood exactly what that meant. The Directorate guarded its military communications with almost obsessive secrecy. The chances of accidentally intercepting one of their encrypted transmissions were so small that most intelligence agencies considered it effectively impossible. Steve kept working. If the encryption itself refused to reveal its contents, perhaps the surrounding metadata would prove less careful. Engineers often focused on protecting information while overlooking the tiny details surrounding it. Transmission timing, synchronization intervals, authentication schedules, navigation updates. Those details frequently escaped the same level of protection. Patiently, Steve began assembling dozens of tiny fragments into a larger picture. Another hour passed. Slowly, patterns emerged. The forgotten relay was not receiving tactical orders. It was participating in a scheduled synchronization cycle. Whatever system remained connected to the relay expected periodic status confirmations from every surviving maintenance node across the network. The realization puzzled everyone aboard. There was no practical reason for a 60-year-old wreck to remain part of an active military maintenance schedule. Unless nobody aboard spoke the possibility aloud until Steve quietly identified the destination encoded within the synchronization sequence. The Aethelgard. For several long moments, nobody moved. The galaxy's most terrifying machine had somehow maintained a hidden connection to a forgotten wreck drifting unnoticed inside an abandoned battlefield. Steve continued studying the synchronization data, and another remarkable detail soon appeared. During each maintenance cycle, the network briefly distributed updated navigation authentication to every active relay. It was an elegant way of ensuring every maintenance node remained synchronized with the central system. Which also meant something almost unbelievable. For a very brief window during every synchronization cycle, this forgotten relay received the current coordinates of the Aethelgard itself. No intelligence agency had ever managed to track the automated dreadnought consistently. No spy network had ever located it with certainty. Yet an abandoned communications relay hidden inside a forgotten wreck quietly received its location as part of a routine maintenance update. Leo stared silently at the stars beyond the cockpit window while the implications settled over the bridge. They had set out that morning expecting little more than another profitable salvage run. Instead, pure chance had placed them within reach of one of the Directorate's deepest secrets. None of them realized it yet, but this forgotten relay was only the beginning. Buried within its next synchronization packet waited another piece of information, one so extraordinary that it would transform an impossible dream into the greatest heist the galaxy had ever witnessed. The bridge of the Rust Bucket remained unusually quiet as Steve continued dissecting the intercepted transmission. Hours had passed since the crew discovered that the forgotten Vrykul relay was still communicating with the Directorate's highest military network, yet nobody had suggested leaving the battlefield. Even Mara, who usually insisted on avoiding anything remotely connected to the Vrykul, remained at her station, watching the data slowly take shape across Steve's displays. They all understood that they had stumbled onto something extraordinary. The only question was whether it would make them unimaginably wealthy or get them all killed before the week was over. Steve ignored the silence around him. His fingers danced across the keyboard as dozens of custom programs attacked the transmission from different angles. Breaking the encryption itself remained impossible, but he had never intended to crack it head-on. Over the years, he had learned that even the most secure computer systems often betrayed themselves through the smallest details. Engineers obsessed over protecting the message while overlooking the information surrounding it. Packet timing, synchronization intervals, error correction routines, and maintenance metadata could reveal secrets that the encrypted contents never would. It was slow, painstaking work, but patience had always been Steve's greatest weapon. Nearly another hour passed before he finally stopped typing. He replayed the latest synchronization burst several times, comparing it with every previous transmission they had recorded. At first glance, the packets appeared almost identical, but hidden deep within their structure was a tiny sequence that changed during every update. Steve enlarged the sequence until it filled the main display. It wasn't random, it was a rotating maintenance schedule. "Everyone needs to see this," he said quietly. The crew gathered around the console as Steve explained what he had found. Every synchronization cycle contained references to dozens of automated maintenance procedures performed aboard the Aethelguard. Most of them meant very little without access to classified engineering manuals, but one entry appeared repeatedly across every transmission. Unlike the others, it carried an unusually high security priority and was always accompanied by the same designation: Central Ignition Synchronization. The words immediately captured Evelyn's attention. Although she wasn't an engineer, she had spent years researching advanced alien technologies, and even she recognized the significance of the phrase. Every artificial intelligence, every autonomous fleet, and every massive military installation ultimately depended on a stable energy source. If the Aethelguard truly possessed a legendary central ignition core, then a synchronization procedure almost certainly involved its primary power systems. Steve nodded. That was exactly what he had been thinking. He continued digging through the maintenance metadata, assembling tiny fragments that individually revealed almost nothing but collectively painted an increasingly detailed picture. The synchronization occurred on a precise schedule that repeated every few standard weeks. During that brief maintenance window, the Aethelguard temporarily shifted control of its primary energy systems into diagnostic mode while every major subsystem verified its connection to the core. It was an elegant design. Automated maintenance reduced long-term wear without requiring engineers to physically service the colossal machine. Then Steve found the detail that made everyone aboard forget to breathe. According to the maintenance sequence, the central ignition core was not synchronized inside its armored containment chamber. For approximately 8 minutes, it was transferred into a dedicated synchronization cradle positioned inside an enormous engineering bay. The room fell silent. Leo slowly looked up from the display. "So the single most valuable object in the entire galaxy," he began carefully, "gets moved into a maintenance chamber every few weeks?" Steve hesitated before answering. "That's what the data suggests." Mara immediately shook her head. "No." Leo glanced toward her. "You don't even know what I'm thinking." "I know exactly what you're thinking. I'm simply asking questions." "No," Mara repeated firmly. "You're looking for loopholes." Owen chuckled from the opposite side of the bridge. After years of working together, he recognized that expression on Leo's face better than anyone. It was the same expression Leo wore before volunteering for impossible salvage operations, racing unstable reactors, or attempting repairs that every engineer in civilized space would have declared suicidal. Curiosity had always been Leo's greatest strength. Unfortunately, it was also his greatest weakness. Evelyn folded her arms and quietly reminded everyone that they were discussing the heart of the most heavily protected machine ever constructed. Entire governments had spent generations trying to uncover even the smallest secret about the Aethelguard. Elite intelligence agencies with virtually unlimited funding had failed repeatedly. The 5 of them were scavengers flying a ship held together by recycled mining equipment and optimism. For several moments, nobody argued with her. She wasn't wrong. The idea was ridiculous, almost insulting in its impossibility. Steve, however, wasn't finished. He enlarged another section of the maintenance packet and explained that the synchronization cycle temporarily disabled several internal security systems to prevent interference with the diagnostics. It wasn't a complete shutdown. That would have been reckless even by Vrykul standards. Instead, certain autonomous defense networks entered passive monitoring mode while engineering systems recalibrated themselves. Security drones remained active, but their patrol routes changed to accommodate the maintenance sequence. Bulkhead seals cycled open and closed automatically as diagnostic equipment moved through the ship. None of those changes would matter to an attacking fleet, but they might matter to someone trying not to be seen. Leo said nothing. He simply listened. That worried Mara more than any reckless speech ever could. Whenever Leo started talking excitedly, his plans usually collapsed under their own enthusiasm. When he became quiet instead, it meant he was genuinely thinking. Steve continued examining the intercepted data while the others returned to their stations. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but every member of the crew found themselves glancing back toward the main display every few minutes. The impossible had a strange way of capturing the imagination. It wasn't greed that kept pulling their attention toward the synchronization schedule. It was curiosity. The Vrykul had spent centuries convincing the galaxy that the Aethelgard was untouchable. Now, for the first time, a tiny crack had appeared in that illusion. As the hours passed, Steve managed to recover one final fragment from the transmission. It wasn't much, just a navigation authentication packet attached to the upcoming maintenance cycle, but it confirmed something that transformed speculation into undeniable fact. The relay would receive the Aethelgard's updated coordinates during the next synchronization. Not estimates, not projected patrol routes, its exact location. For a ship that spent most of its existence hidden somewhere among the stars, that information alone would be worth an unimaginable fortune. Leo leaned back in his chair and stared through the cockpit window. Outside, broken warships continued drifting silently through the ancient battlefield, completely unaware that history had just shifted around them. He had spent years chasing valuable salvage, rare technology, and forgotten military hardware, but none of it compared to what now sat glowing on Steve's monitor. They weren't looking at treasure. They were looking at opportunity. A dangerous, absurd, completely unreasonable opportunity. Mara eventually broke the silence. If anyone says the words, "We should steal it," I'm walking out of this ship. Nobody answered. Steve pretended to be fascinated by his keyboard. Owen suddenly became very interested in organizing cargo inventory. Even Evelyn quietly returned to her research terminal. Leo rubbed his chin thoughtfully before asking what sounded like the most innocent question imaginable. Hypothetically, 5 pairs of eyes immediately turned toward him. He smiled. "I'm just asking academically." Mara sighed so deeply that it almost sounded painful. There is absolutely nothing academic about that smile. Leo raised both hands in surrender. "I'm not saying we should do anything. You haven't stopped thinking about it for the last 20 minutes. I've been thinking about several things. All of them illegal." He couldn't honestly deny it. The bridge erupted into quiet laughter, briefly breaking the tension that had settled over the crew. It was the kind of laughter shared by people who had survived too many disasters together to panic immediately. None of them truly believed they were capable of stealing the heart of the galaxy's greatest superweapon. At least, not yet. Outside, the silent battlefield continued its endless drift beneath distant stars, while hidden deep inside a forgotten communications relay, the countdown toward the next synchronization cycle continued without interruption. Somewhere far beyond the frontier, the Aethelgard carried on with mathematical precision, completely unaware that 5 human outcasts flying one of the ugliest salvage ships in the galaxy had just uncovered the first thread that could unravel its greatest secret. For the Vrykul Directorate, the synchronization was nothing more than another routine maintenance procedure. For the crew of the Rust Bucket, it had become the beginning of the most outrageous idea any of them had ever dared to imagine. Leo Maddox had always believed there were two kinds of impossible jobs. The first kind was genuinely impossible, the sort that ended with people floating lifelessly in space because they had mistaken courage for competence. The second kind only appeared impossible because nobody had been reckless enough to examine it from a different angle. The distinction had kept him alive through years of salvaging abandoned battlefields, but it had also earned him more scars than he cared to count. As the Rust Bucket departed the ancient graveyard and accelerated toward open space, he found himself staring at the stars in thoughtful silence. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next salvage contract or the price of reactor coils. His mind kept returning to a single question. If the Vrykul truly believed the Aethelgard was untouchable, had they become so confident in their own perfection that they had overlooked the smallest weakness? Nobody mentioned the intercepted transmission for the first several hours of the journey. Each member of the crew buried themselves in familiar routines, almost as if pretending the discovery had never happened. Mara disappeared into the engine compartment to replace worn coolant lines that had been scheduled for maintenance weeks earlier. Owen spent the afternoon rebuilding a damaged cargo lift using spare parts that had never belonged together. Evelyn catalogued alien microorganisms collected during previous expeditions, carefully preserving samples that most scientists would have considered priceless. Steve, however, never stopped studying the recovered data. Every spare cycle of the ship's computers was dedicated to analyzing the synchronization packets from the forgotten relay, searching for details so small that another analyst might have dismissed them as meaningless. Steve understood better than anyone that extraordinary discoveries were rarely hidden behind enormous clues. More often, they revealed themselves through tiny inconsistencies that everyone else overlooked. By the following day, the atmosphere aboard the Rust Bucket had changed in subtle ways. Conversations that normally revolved around fuel costs or salvage prices kept drifting back toward the Aethelgard. Nobody openly proposed stealing anything. That would have sounded absurd even to them. Instead, they asked harmless questions that gradually became less harmless the longer they were discussed. How large would the synchronization chamber need to be? How many engineering drones would maintain a machine of that size? Would the automated systems prioritize defending the ship from external attack while ignoring internal maintenance traffic? Each question naturally led to another, and before anyone realized it, they had begun examining the problem as though it were another engineering puzzle instead of the greatest military secret in known space. Steve eventually gathered everyone on the bridge after uncovering another layer of information hidden within the synchronization metadata. Although the intercepted packets remained heavily encrypted, they contained countless timing references that allowed him to estimate the sequence of maintenance operations aboard the Aethelgard. Rather than conducting every diagnostic simultaneously, the enormous machine divided its systems into carefully organized phases. Power distribution recalibrated first, internal communications followed. Security algorithms then shifted into diagnostic mode while engineering systems verified structural integrity. Only after every preceding step completed successfully did the central ignition core enter its synchronization cradle. It was an elegant process designed to eliminate the possibility of cascading failures. The more Steve explained the procedure, the more one uncomfortable realization emerged. The Vrykul had optimized the synchronization sequence for efficiency rather than defense. Their engineers had never imagined anyone would infiltrate the interior of the Aethelgard during the maintenance cycle because doing so appeared completely impossible. Every security protocol focused overwhelmingly on preventing hostile fleets from approaching the dreadnought. The possibility that intruders might already be inside simply did not receive the same level of attention. That observation lingered in everyone's thoughts long after the meeting ended. Mara refused to let optimism replace common sense. She reminded the crew that discovering a weakness was not the same as exploiting one. The Aethelgard still possessed thousands of autonomous drones, countless internal sensors, sophisticated artificial intelligence, and defensive systems capable of destroying entire fleets. Finding a maintenance window did not magically transform an automated fortress into an abandoned warehouse. Even reaching the synchronization chamber would require bypassing technologies decades beyond anything installed aboard the Rust Bucket. Nobody argued with her. Instead, Leo asked Steve a different question. Could the Rust Bucket even approach the Aethelgard without being detected? Steve considered the problem carefully before admitting that the answer was probably no. The salvager's engines produced far too much thermal radiation, its communication systems lacked military-grade masking technology, and its transponder would immediately identify it as an unauthorized civilian vessel. Approaching the dreadnought directly would almost certainly result in interception long before visual range. For a few moments, the dream appeared to collapse under the weight of reality. Then Owen quietly reminded everyone that they weren't flying a normal ship. The Rust Bucket had spent years collecting pieces of abandoned technology from dozens of civilizations. Most of those systems had never been intended to work together, but that strange collection of incompatible machinery had become the vessel's greatest strength. Buried beneath the patched armor were obsolete mining scanners, dismantled stealth plating recovered from pirate frigates, industrial electromagnetic dampeners, experimental heat exchangers, and enough salvaged electronic components to confuse any respectable engineer. Individually, none of those systems could fool the Directorate. Combined creatively, however, they might produce something the Vrykul had never anticipated. That possibility reignited everyone's imagination. Instead of discussing theft, the crew shifted their attention toward pure engineering. Suppose, purely as an intellectual exercise, someone wanted to reduce the Rust Bucket's thermal signature. Could the old mining coolant system be modified to absorb excess heat? Could the obsolete stealth panels be rearranged to scatter active sensor pulses instead of simply absorbing them? Would industrial excavation drones generate electromagnetic interference strong enough to disguise the ship's approach against natural background radiation? The bridge gradually transformed into something resembling a research laboratory. Evelyn surprised everyone by contributing ideas drawn from biology rather than engineering. During one of her earlier expeditions, she had studied microscopic organisms living inside the atmosphere of a gas giant. Those organisms generated naturally occurring electromagnetic disturbances that confused orbital survey equipment. If similar interference patterns could be reproduced electronically, they might create artificial sensor noise convincing enough to conceal brief movements. Steve immediately recognized the potential and began writing simulation software while Mara calculated the power requirements. Hours became days. The crew stopped thinking like scavengers. They started thinking like problem solvers. Every obstacle revealed another question. Every question inspired another experiment. The remarkable thing was that nobody ever declared they were planning a heist. Such a statement would have sounded ridiculous. Instead, they approached each challenge independently, treating it as another fascinating engineering puzzle. Could they disguise their heat signature? Perhaps. Could they imitate maintenance traffic? Possibly. Could they temporarily confuse autonomous sensor networks? Under the right conditions, maybe. Each individual solution appeared achievable on its own. Only when viewed together did they begin resembling something extraordinary. Late one evening, Steve completed the first comprehensive simulation using every fragment of information recovered from the synchronization relay. The results filled the main display with hundreds of projected flight paths, security responses, and probability calculations. Most scenarios ended exactly as expected. The Rust Bucket was detected almost immediately and destroyed before reaching the outer defensive perimeter. Others survived slightly longer but failed once internal patrol drones identified unauthorized movement. Then one simulation continued running. Nobody spoke as the projection unfolded. Instead of flying directly toward the dreadnought, the virtual Rust Bucket approached alongside a stream of maintenance debris naturally orbiting the Aethelgard. It released several modified industrial drones programmed to imitate automated inspection equipment while simultaneously broadcasting carefully crafted electromagnetic interference. For nearly 6 minutes, the dreadnought's sensor network interpreted the entire formation as harmless maintenance activity. The simulation eventually failed. An internal scanner noticed a microscopic inconsistency in one drone's identification signal, triggering a security response that ended the operation. Yet the silence on the bridge carried a different feeling this time. The plan had not failed immediately. It had almost worked. Steve quietly reran the simulation after correcting the identification error. Nobody realized they had unconsciously leaned closer to the display until the second projection reached nearly 8 minutes before finally collapsing for an entirely different reason. This time, they had reached the engineering section. The room remained silent long after the simulation ended. The impossible still looked impossible. But for the first time since discovering the forgotten relay, it no longer looked completely absurd. Somewhere deep within the enormous calculations filling Steve's monitors, hidden beneath countless failures and impossible odds, the crew of the Rust Bucket had just caught their first genuine glimpse of a path that might one day carry 5 human outcasts into the heart of the most feared machine in the galaxy. For the next several days, life aboard the Rust Bucket settled into an unusual rhythm. From the outside, nothing had changed. The battered salvage ship continued drifting from one forgotten wreck to another, collecting damaged reactors, stripped armor plating, abandoned sensor arrays, and whatever valuable machinery previous scavengers had overlooked. Any passing patrol would have seen exactly what it expected: a group of independent salvagers trying to earn enough credits to survive another month in the frontier. That illusion suited Leo perfectly. If anyone ever investigated their movements, there would be nothing suspicious to find. They were simply doing what they had always done. The difference existed only inside the ship, where every seemingly ordinary salvage operation had quietly become part of a much larger puzzle. The crew quickly realized that the greatest obstacle was not reaching the Aethelgard. It was surviving long enough to escape after taking the core. Even if they somehow managed to infiltrate the automated dreadnought during its maintenance cycle, stealing the central ignition core would immediately trigger system failures unlike anything the Vrykul had ever anticipated. The artificial intelligence would recognize that its primary power source had disappeared. Emergency protocols would activate. Every drone, every sensor, and every defensive platform would converge on the engineering section within seconds. Any realistic plan had to assume that the moment the core left its synchronization cradle, the entire fortress would become aware that something impossible had just happened. That realization forced them to abandon several early ideas. Owen initially suggested using heavy industrial equipment to cut directly through maintenance bulkheads, but the simulation showed that such operations would generate enough vibration to alert structural monitoring systems long before they reached the engineering decks. Mara briefly explored the possibility of temporarily disabling the dreadnought's internal power distribution. Yet Steve demonstrated that the artificial intelligence would interpret the disruption as sabotage and immediately lock down every compartment connected to the reactor network. One by one, every aggressive solution collapsed under careful analysis. The more they studied the problem, the more obvious one truth became. They could not fight the Aethelgard. They could not outrun it. They could not overpower its defenses. Their only chance, however remote, was convincing the machine that nothing unusual was happening until it was already too late. Steve immersed himself completely in the behavior of automated systems. Having spent years breaking into corporate networks, he understood that computers rarely behaved irrationally. They followed instructions with perfect consistency, even when those instructions produced ridiculous results. Human guards became suspicious when they encountered something unexpected. Machines simply compared observations against predefined patterns. If an event fit an approved pattern closely enough, it often escaped further scrutiny. The challenge, therefore, was not fooling an intelligent mind. It was fooling a predictable one. Every intercepted synchronization packet revealed another tiny piece of the maintenance routine. Inspection drones followed identical paths every cycle. Diagnostic equipment transmitted standardized identification codes. Repair units communicated using remarkably repetitive data bursts. Individually, these details appeared insignificant. Together, they formed a behavioral blueprint of the engineering network hidden inside the Aethelgard. Steve began reconstructing that blueprint aboard the Rust Bucket, creating increasingly sophisticated simulations that behaved exactly as the Directorate's maintenance systems were expected to behave. Meanwhile, Mara transformed one section of the cargo bay into what she jokingly referred to as the world's least professional research laboratory. Salvaged drones lay scattered across workbenches beside damaged communication relays, mining lasers, obsolete navigation processors, and enough loose wiring to frighten any certified engineer. Under ordinary circumstances, most of the equipment would have been sold immediately for desperately needed credits. Instead, every useful component was stripped apart, tested, modified, and rebuilt into something entirely different. Nothing aboard the Rust Bucket was designed for military infiltration, but almost everything possessed some hidden capability if viewed creatively enough. Owen approached the problem from an entirely different perspective. While everyone else focused on sophisticated electronics, he examined physical infrastructure. Years spent repairing mining stations had taught him that massive industrial facilities often shared the same engineering philosophy regardless of who built them. Air circulation required maintenance shafts. Power conduits required inspection access. Coolant systems required emergency bypasses. Automated factories required hidden service corridors that ordinary personnel never noticed because they were never meant to use them. The Aethelguard might be the most advanced machine ever constructed, but it still obeyed the fundamental realities of engineering. If something could break, someone had needed a way to repair it. That simple observation inspired another series of simulations. Steve reconstructed the engineering decks using every fragment of structural data recovered from the intercepted transmissions. Most of the internal layout remained speculative, but maintenance scheduling revealed surprising amounts of information. Inspection routes suggested corridor lengths. Repair intervals hinted at equipment placement. Power distribution timings revealed approximate distances between major systems. It resembled assembling a gigantic puzzle while missing half the pieces, yet every day the picture became slightly clearer. Evelyn contributed in ways none of them had expected. While studying biological adaptation across dozens of alien ecosystems, she had learned that survival rarely depended upon strength alone. Countless organisms escaped predators by blending into existing environmental patterns instead of resisting them directly. Some mimicked harmless species, others reproduced natural sounds or electromagnetic signals until predators simply ignored their presence. Listening to Steve describe automated maintenance traffic, she recognized striking similarities. The crew did not need to become invisible. They simply needed to resemble something the Aethelguard had already decided was harmless. That idea fundamentally changed their approach. Instead of designing equipment capable of defeating security systems, they began designing equipment that belonged within them. Old maintenance drones were rebuilt with carefully copied identification signatures. Industrial sensor packages were modified to imitate routine diagnostic equipment. Even the Rust Bucket's communications array underwent extensive alterations until many of its transmissions resembled the compressed maintenance packets traveling through the Directorate's own engineering network. None of the imitations were perfect. They did not need to be. They only needed to survive long enough to pass routine inspection before the synchronization cycle ended. As their preparations continued, another uncomfortable question emerged. Why would the Vrykul expose something as valuable as the central ignition core in the first place? The answer appeared after Steve spent nearly an entire night studying power management theory. By morning he believed he understood the logic. The core did not merely produce energy. It continuously synchronized every subsystem throughout the dreadnought, ensuring that billions of autonomous processes remained mathematically aligned. Over time, microscopic timing errors accumulated across such an enormous network. The periodic synchronization cycle corrected those errors before they grew dangerous. It was less like refueling an engine and more like resetting the heartbeat of an unimaginably complex machine. Unfortunately for the Directorate, solving one engineering problem had quietly created another. For those brief minutes, the heart of their greatest weapon became physically accessible. Not undefended, not unguarded, simply reachable. That distinction consumed Leo's thoughts more than anything else. He knew better than to mistake opportunity for success. Every simulation still ended with failure more often than not. Sometimes the crew survived 6 minutes before being detected. Sometimes they reached the engineering decks only to discover that extracting the core required equipment they did not possess. Occasionally the rust bucket escaped the immediate security response only to be destroyed by pursuing drone squadrons minutes later. Each failure taught them something new, but it also reminded them how narrow their chances truly were. Even so, the probability continued changing. 1% became 3, 3 became 5, 5 slowly climbed higher. The numbers remained terrible by any reasonable standard. Yet they were no longer 0. Late one evening, Steve completed another comprehensive simulation using every improvement developed during the past week. The virtual rust bucket approached beneath the cover of maintenance traffic, released its disguised drones, synchronized its transmissions with the engineering network, and slipped deeper into the projected interior of the Aethelgard than any previous attempt. For nearly 7 uninterrupted minutes, the artificial intelligence interpreted every movement as routine maintenance activity. It was the longest they had ever survived. The simulation finally ended when a patrol drone requested an authentication sequence that Steve had never observed in the intercepted transmissions. Without the correct response, the deception collapsed almost instantly. Nobody seemed disappointed. Instead, Steve smiled. Every failure until now had resulted from mistakes they had already understood. This failure resulted from information they simply did not possess. And information, unlike impossible odds, could still be found. For the first time since discovering the forgotten relay hidden inside the forgotten battlefield, the crew of the Rust Bucket stopped asking whether the heist could theoretically succeed. They began asking a far more dangerous question. What else did they still need to learn before they dared to try? A week passed before anyone aboard the Rust Bucket admitted, even to themselves, that they were no longer studying the Aethelgard out of curiosity. What had begun as an intellectual exercise had quietly evolved into preparation. Every calculation, every salvaged component, and every intercepted fragment of data was slowly being arranged into something far more dangerous than a theory. Yet despite that realization, Leo refused to let the crew rush forward. Years of surviving the frontier had taught him that impatience was responsible for more deaths than enemy weapons. If they were truly considering the greatest theft in galactic history, then they would prepare as though they had only one chance, because they almost certainly did. The biggest problem remained painfully obvious. They knew where the Aethelgard would be during its next synchronization cycle, and they understood enough about its maintenance routines to identify a potential opening. But they still had no reliable method of navigating once inside the automated dreadnought. Steve's simulations had reconstructed broad sections of the engineering decks using maintenance schedules and power distribution patterns, but vast portions of the internal layout remained educated guesses. That uncertainty was unacceptable. A single wrong turn inside a machine the size of a moon could waste precious minutes, and the synchronization window offered only 8. Every second would matter. Rather than searching for more military transmissions, Steve began examining something far less obvious. Throughout the decades, hundreds of Vrykul ships had been destroyed across the frontier. Most were stripped clean by scavengers, but the Directorate's obsession with standardization meant that even obsolete vessels often carried engineering software built upon the same design philosophy as their newest warships. If enough fragments of those old systems could be recovered, perhaps they would reveal how Vrykul engineers organized internal infrastructure. They did not need exact blueprints. They only needed to understand how Vrykul minds approached complex problems. That realization transformed their salvage operations. Instead of collecting the most valuable components, the crew began searching specifically for damaged engineering terminals, maintenance drones, navigation processors, and corrupted data cores. Much of the recovered equipment appeared worthless at first glance, its memory banks fractured by battle damage or decades of exposure to cosmic radiation. But Steve had never expected intact files. Tiny fragments were enough. A maintenance log here, A diagnostic routine there. A partially corrupted service manual recovered from another wreck several sectors away. Individually, they resembled meaningless scraps. Together, they slowly exposed patterns. The Vrykul, Steve discovered, were creatures of extraordinary consistency. Every engineering team followed identical organizational principles regardless of the ship's size. Maintenance corridors always branched from major power conduits at mathematically predictable intervals. Emergency repair stations occupied standardized positions relative to reactor compartments. Service drones preferred identical routing algorithms whether they operated aboard a frigate or a planetary installation. The more evidence accumulated, the clearer the picture became. The Aethelgard might be unimaginably larger than any vessel they had previously salvaged, but its designers still thought like Vrykul engineers. Each discovery allowed Steve to refine his simulations. Entire corridors shifted into more logical positions. Previously disconnected maintenance routes suddenly aligned. Areas that had once resembled random guesses gradually transformed into coherent engineering networks. The virtual model remained incomplete, yet with every revision it became less speculative and more believable. Meanwhile, Mara focused on the rust bucket itself. She knew the old ship better than anyone alive, including the people who had originally built it decades earlier. Every weakness, every vibration, every unreliable system had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. If the crew intended to approach the Aethelgard undetected, the rust bucket needed to become something it had never been before. Quiet. That objective sounded almost comical. The ship's engines had always produced enough noise to announce their arrival several thousand kilometers away. Heat leaked from poorly insulated conduits. Shield generators fluctuated unpredictably whenever auxiliary systems activated. Even the aging life support compressors produced electromagnetic interference powerful enough to confuse civilian sensors. Mara attacked each problem methodically. Cooling pipes were rerouted through abandoned mining exchangers recovered months earlier. Engine housings received additional insulation fabricated from salvaged stealth composites. Shield emitters were rebuilt almost from scratch until their output stabilized within tolerances the original manufacturers had probably considered impossible. None of the improvements made the rust bucket elegant. It simply became less conspicuous. Owen contributed in his own uniquely practical way. During years spent repairing industrial excavation machinery, he had accumulated an enormous collection of specialized tools that most people considered obsolete. Massive hydraulic spreaders, plasma cutters, magnetic lifting systems, and compact structural anchors filled nearly an entire storage compartment. Originally intended for dismantling mining equipment buried beneath kilometers of rock, they possessed one unexpected advantage. They generated almost no electronic signature. Where advanced military tools relied upon sophisticated power systems, Owen's equipment relied on brute mechanical efficiency. Against automated sensors searching for advanced infiltration devices, old-fashioned industrial machinery might actually attract less attention. Even Evelyn found herself studying subjects far removed from biology. The central ignition core fascinated her less as a power source than as a technological achievement. Based upon everything Steve had recovered, the core behaved unlike any conventional reactor. Rather than continuously generating energy, it appeared to regulate and synchronize energy already flowing throughout the dreadnought. That suggested astonishing complexity. It also suggested fragility. Removing such a device carelessly might not simply disable the Aethelgard. It could trigger catastrophic instability throughout the surrounding engineering systems. That possibility concerned everyone. Their objective had never been destruction. They wanted the core intact, preferably without vaporizing themselves in the process. Steve therefore devoted several sleepless nights to modeling the synchronization sequence itself. Every intercepted transmission contained tiny timing references indicating when individual subsystems entered and exited diagnostic mode. By comparing dozens of cycles, he finally identified something that had remained hidden until now. The synchronization did not begin the instant the core entered the maintenance cradle. Instead, There was a brief preparation phase lasting approximately 90 seconds while surrounding systems stabilized their energy flow. During that interval, engineering drones became unusually active, transporting calibration equipment throughout the reactor complex. It was exactly the kind of organized movement they had been hoping to find. Large numbers of maintenance drones meant increased network traffic. Increased traffic meant additional electromagnetic interference. Additional interference meant a greater opportunity to disappear inside the noise. For the first time, Steve could identify not merely an 8-minute window, but a precise sequence within those 8 minutes where automated systems would be operating at their busiest. Leo studied the updated timeline for nearly an hour without speaking. He had learned to trust Steve's instincts, but he also understood that simulations had a dangerous habit of encouraging optimism. Reality rarely followed computer models. Unexpected complications always emerged. Machines malfunctioned. Sensors detected anomalies. Tiny mistakes multiplied into fatal disasters. Every successful salvage mission he had ever completed had depended less upon careful planning than upon adapting after the plan inevitably failed. That thought inspired an entirely different discussion. Instead of asking how they would execute the heist, Leo asked how they would survive when everything inevitably went wrong. The question changed the mood aboard the ship. Escape routes replaced infiltration routes as the focus of every conversation. Spare engines were dismantled so emergency components could be installed aboard the rust bucket. Backup navigation systems were hidden beneath cargo decking in case the bridge became unusable. Owen reinforced structural bulkheads around the cargo hold, anticipating the possibility that whatever contained the central ignition core might weigh far more than anyone expected. Mara quietly assembled emergency repair kits in nearly every compartment of the ship, ensuring that critical systems could be restored even if explosions separated the crew. No one viewed these preparations as pessimistic. They viewed them as realistic. Success would not belong to the crew that executed a flawless plan. Success would belong to the crew that remained alive after the flawless plan inevitably fell apart. Late on the 8th evening, Steve completed what he believed to be the most accurate simulation they had yet constructed. Using every recovered engineering fragment, every maintenance schedule, every synchronization packet, and every structural pattern discovered across months of salvaged vehicle technology, he recreated the first 12 minutes of the operation. The projection unfolded differently than any previous attempt. The rust bucket entered the maintenance corridor undetected. Its disguised drones blended naturally into the engineering traffic. Internal sensors ignored the false maintenance signatures. Minute after minute passed. 6 minutes. 7. Then 8. For the first time, the simulation reached the synchronization chamber before ending. Nobody celebrated. The model still failed moments later because they lacked one crucial piece of information. They had finally discovered a path to the heart of the Aethelgard. Now they needed to learn how to steal the heart itself. The simulation's success should have been a moment of celebration, yet the bridge of the rust bucket remained strangely quiet. Reaching the synchronization chamber inside a computer model was one thing. Walking into the real chamber aboard the most feared machine in the galaxy was something entirely different. The crew understood that the simulation had only answered the first question. It had shown that reaching the central ignition core might be possible. Unfortunately, it had also revealed the much larger problem waiting beyond the door. None of them had the slightest idea how the core was actually secured inside the synchronization cradle, how it was disconnected from the Aethelgard systems, or whether it could even be removed without triggering an immediate catastrophic failure. They had found a path to the prize, but the prize itself remained a complete mystery. Steve spent the next several days studying every fragment of technical data they had recovered from vehicle wrecks throughout the frontier. He ignored navigation records and weapon specifications, focusing entirely on engineering documentation. Most of the recovered files were incomplete, damaged beyond recognition, or written in highly specialized technical language. Even so, a pattern gradually emerged. The vehicle rarely built machines around permanent assemblies. Instead, they preferred modular systems that could be removed, upgraded, or replaced by autonomous maintenance drones without interrupting the operation of the surrounding infrastructure. Their philosophy favored efficiency above sentiment. If a component eventually wore out, another identical component simply took its place. That discovery encouraged Steve, but it also raised another question. If the central ignition core truly formed the heart of the Aethelgard, why would its designers construct a synchronization chamber that allowed it to be physically moved? The answer seemed contradictory at first. A machine that valuable should have been permanently sealed behind layers of armor. Yet every intercepted maintenance schedule confirmed the same sequence. During synchronization, the core left its containment housing and entered a specialized cradle designed specifically for calibration. The procedure repeated with perfect regularity, suggesting that movement was not an emergency protocol but an essential part of normal operation. Evelyn approached the mystery from a scientific perspective rather than an engineering one. She compared the available information with biological systems she had studied throughout her career. The more she examined the synchronization cycle, the more it reminded her of a living organism instead of a machine. Every few weeks, countless independent systems paused long enough to recalibrate themselves against a single stable reference point, much like cells within a living body continuously synchronized their internal clocks. If her theory was correct, then the central ignition core did far more than generate energy. It provided perfect timing. Every autonomous drone, every sensor array, every defensive platform, and every manufacturing system aboard the Aethelgard relied upon the core to maintain precise coordination. Without that common reference, microscopic timing errors would slowly spread throughout the network until the entire machine began falling out of harmony with itself. The implications were staggering. Stealing the core would not cause the Aethelgard to explode. It would cause it to lose synchronization. For an ordinary warship, such an interruption might prove inconvenient. For an automated fortress that depended entirely upon billions of coordinated processes, the consequences could be disastrous. Steve immediately revised the simulations to account for Evelyn's theory. The new projections showed something unexpected. Instead of instantly collapsing into chaos, the Aethelgard attempted to compensate for the missing core by shifting thousands of subsystems into emergency stabilization mode. Engineering drones abandoned routine maintenance. Sensor arrays recalibrated themselves repeatedly. Manufacturing rings slowed their production cycles while navigation systems continuously corrected accumulating timing errors. The artificial intelligence devoted enormous processing power simply to keeping the machine functioning. Ironically, removing the core might overwhelm the dreadnought with its own emergency procedures before it ever fully understood what had happened. Leo studied the updated projections for a long time before speaking. If the simulations proved even partially accurate, then the greatest weapon ever built possessed an unexpected weakness. It was so large, so sophisticated, and so dependent upon perfect internal coordination that losing its central reference point would force it to fight itself before it could effectively pursue intruders. They would not defeat the Aethelgard. The Aethelgard would temporarily distract itself trying to survive. Even so, one enormous problem remained. How heavy was the central ignition core? Nobody knew. Rumors described it as everything from a compact energy crystal to a reactor the size of a transport shuttle. Without knowing its dimensions or mass, designing extraction equipment became almost impossible. Owen proposed preparing for the worst. If the core turned out to be smaller than expected, they would simply carry it manually. If it proved far larger, the rust bucket already possessed industrial lifting equipment powerful enough to move mining machinery weighing hundreds of tons. The cargo hold slowly filled with reinforced magnetic anchors, compact hydraulic supports, adjustable transport frames, and modified gravitic stabilizers. None of the equipment looked particularly impressive. Most of it appeared as though it belonged on an asteroid refinery rather than aboard a spacecraft preparing for the greatest theft in history. That suited Owen perfectly. Reliable tools mattered far more than elegant ones. Mara concentrated on another concern that everyone else had quietly ignored. Every simulation assumed the rust bucket would escape the immediate area after acquiring the core, but no one had seriously discussed what would happen afterward. The Directorate would not simply abandon its search. The moment the synchronization failed, every available fleet would begin hunting for whoever had accomplished the impossible. Their patched-together salvage vessel could never outrun dedicated military pursuit indefinitely. They needed a destination long before they needed an escape route. The crew considered dozens of possibilities. Smuggler stations scattered throughout the frontier were rejected almost immediately because the Directorate would search them first. Independent colonies lacked the resources to hide something so valuable. Even the largest criminal syndicates would probably surrender the crew in exchange for political favors rather than risk provoking the Vrykul. Every obvious refuge became a trap the longer they discussed it. Eventually, Leo suggested thinking like scavengers instead of fugitives. Whenever authorities searched for missing ships, they focused on populated regions, established trade routes, and known pirate territories. Almost nobody willingly traveled into the dead expanse, a sprawling region of unstable gravitational anomalies left behind by an ancient stellar catastrophe. Navigation systems functioned poorly there. Long-range sensors became unreliable. Automated guidance algorithms frequently failed altogether. The same conditions that made the dead expanse nearly useless for commerce also made it an ideal hiding place for anyone capable of navigating by experience rather than sophisticated computers. Owen immediately smiled. Years before joining the crew, he had worked mining contracts along the outer edge of the dead expanse. Most captains considered the region cursed. Owen considered it familiar. He knew where gravitational currents shifted unexpectedly, where ancient asteroid clusters provided shelter, and where abandoned mining stations still drifted unnoticed among the anomalies. It would never be safe, but safety had never been part of their profession. The idea gradually gained support. If everything went according to plan, the dead expanse would become their temporary sanctuary while the galaxy searched everywhere else. If everything went badly, at least they would have somewhere to run. As preparations continued, an unexpected sense of calm settled over the rust bucket. The excitement that had accompanied the discovery of the synchronization relay slowly gave way to quiet determination. Nobody boasted about stealing the Aethelgard's core anymore. Nobody joked about becoming rich beyond imagination. Those fantasies belonged to the beginning, when the operation still resembled an impossible dream. Now every passing day revealed another practical difficulty demanding careful attention. The romance of the heist had been replaced by endless engineering, cautious planning, and relentless problem-solving. Late one evening, Steve quietly announced that the next synchronization cycle would occur in just under 12 days. The countdown that had existed only as a distant concept suddenly became real. There would be no additional months of preparation. No second chances, no opportunity to postpone the operation until they felt completely ready. The Aethelgard would follow its schedule with mathematical precision whether they acted or not. Leo stood alone on the observation deck long after the others had retired for the night. Beyond the reinforced glass, countless stars stretched across the darkness, indifferent to the choices of a handful of forgotten humans drifting through the frontier. Somewhere among those distant lights, hidden behind layers of secrecy and unimaginable confidence, the greatest machine ever built continued its endless patrol, utterly convinced that no one in the galaxy could ever touch it. Leo could not help smiling. The Vrykul Directorate had spent centuries preparing for powerful enemies. They had never imagined that the first beings bold enough to challenge their masterpiece would be 5 broke scavengers flying the ugliest salvage ship in known space. Only 11 days remained before the next synchronization cycle. For the first time since intercepting the Forgotten Relay, the passage of time became the crew's greatest enemy. Every hour that disappeared was one they could never recover. There were still unanswered questions, unfinished modifications, and countless ways the operation could fail before it even began. Yet there was no delaying the Aethelgard's maintenance schedule. The automated dreadnought would arrive at its designated coordinates, begin its synchronization routine, and complete the process with perfect precision whether the crew of the Rust Bucket was ready or not. A strange transformation settled over the battered salvage ship. The jokes became less frequent. The arguments became shorter. Even the constant background noise of everyday life seemed quieter than usual. Everyone aboard had reached the same conclusion without ever discussing it openly. If they committed to this plan, there would be no turning back halfway through. The moment they approached the Aethelgard, they would become enemies of the most powerful government in the galaxy. Their names would vanish from forgotten salvage registries and appear instead on the highest priority military watchlists ever created. Success might make them unimaginably wealthy. Failure would almost certainly erase them from history. Despite that reality, nobody suggested abandoning the mission. Not because they believed success was guaranteed. Because they had spent too much of their lives allowing fear to dictate their future. Leo noticed the change more clearly than anyone. Months earlier, these people had been little more than professional scavengers sharing an old ship because survival was easier together than alone. Somewhere along the way, they had become something else. Every challenge had drawn them closer. Every impossible problem they solved reminded them why they trusted one another. They were still outcasts in the eyes of civilization, but aboard the Rust Bucket, each person possessed something they had lost long ago. A purpose. Preparation continued with almost obsessive attention to detail. Mara inspected every critical system aboard the ship again and again, refusing to rely on assumptions. Engines were dismantled, reassembled, and tested until their performance remained perfectly consistent under every possible power setting. Backup coolant pumps were installed beside the originals in case battle damage disabled the primary systems. Every fuel line received additional reinforcement. Even life support filters were replaced despite still functioning perfectly. She understood better than anyone that long missions never failed because of dramatic explosions. More often, they failed because someone ignored a small mechanical problem that later became impossible to repair. Owen approached the cargo bay with the same philosophy. Instead of filling it with expensive salvage waiting to be sold, he gradually emptied the entire compartment until only equipment directly related to the mission remained. Every magnetic lift, structural brace, gravitic stabilizer, and industrial transport frame was securely mounted for immediate deployment. He even reinforced the cargo deck itself after calculating that the central ignition core might weigh significantly more than any ordinary reactor assembly. Nobody knew whether those reinforcements would actually be necessary, but Owen had spent his career preparing heavy machinery for unknown loads. Hope, he liked to say, was never an acceptable substitute for proper structural support. Steve devoted nearly every waking hour to refining the electronic deception systems. Hundreds of maintenance signatures flowed continuously across his monitors as he compared authentic Vrykul transmissions with the false identification packets he had constructed aboard the Rust Bucket. Tiny imperfections disappeared one by one. Transmission delays were adjusted by fractions of milliseconds. Diagnostic responses were reorganized to match authentic engineering traffic. Error correction algorithms were intentionally copied from damaged maintenance drones recovered during previous salvage operations. Ironically, reproducing the small flaws present in real maintenance equipment made the false signals appear considerably more authentic than perfectly clean transmissions ever could. Evelyn quietly assembled another kind of preparation. She documented everything. Although no one liked discussing the possibility, she recognized that none of them might survive what they were about to attempt. Throughout the evenings, she carefully recorded engineering notes, scientific observations, intercepted data, and every discovery they had made regarding the Aethelgard. The information was compressed into encrypted archives hidden throughout the Rust Bucket's computer systems. If the crew disappeared, perhaps one day another explorer would recover the ship and learn that the Vrykul's greatest weapon had never truly been invincible. Leo spent much of his time reviewing every simulation they had ever created. The results remained brutally honest. Even after weeks of preparation, success was far from guaranteed. Some simulations still ended before the Rust Bucket reached the outer defensive perimeter. Others progressed deep into the engineering section before unexpected patrol routes exposed the disguised maintenance drones. A handful reached the synchronization chamber only to fail during extraction. The successful outcomes remained painfully rare, yet one encouraging pattern continued emerging. Each improvement the crew made eliminated an entire category of previous failures. Problems that had once seemed impossible slowly disappeared from later simulations altogether. The operation had not become safe. It had simply become less impossible. Several days before departure, Steve finally completed what he believed would be the last major revision to the mission model. The bridge lights dimmed as the simulation filled the central display. This time, nobody interrupted. No one offered suggestions. They simply watched. The virtual rust bucket emerged from deep space and drifted toward the immense silhouette of the Aethelguard while hidden beneath carefully crafted maintenance signatures. Modified industrial drones departed the cargo bay exactly on schedule, blending naturally with the automated engineering traffic surrounding the colossal dreadnought. Internal sensors accepted the deception. Patrol routes continued uninterrupted. Minute after minute passed as the simulated crew slipped deeper into the fortress. 7 minutes. 8 minutes. The synchronization chamber appeared. For the first time, the projection continued beyond the point where every previous attempt had ended. Then the simulation stopped, not because the crew had been detected, because the model contained no further information. Steve slowly leaned back from the controls. They had reached the limit of everything they could predict. Everything beyond that point belonged to reality. An unusual silence filled the bridge. No celebration followed. No triumphant speeches. Only the quiet understanding that months of preparation had finally carried them as far as preparation alone could. Whatever happened next would depend upon the people standing inside this room rather than the computer in front of them. The following morning, the rust bucket changed course. Its destination no longer pointed toward profitable salvage fields or abandoned battle sites. Instead, the aging ship accelerated toward a lonely region of deep space where, according to a forgotten maintenance relay that should never have survived, the Aethelguard would soon begin its next synchronization cycle. The stars outside gradually shifted as the vessel entered faster than light travel. No one spoke during the jump. Each member of the crew retreated into their own thoughts, quietly confronting fears they had carefully hidden behind weeks of engineering discussions and strategic planning. Mara wondered whether she had overlooked some tiny mechanical fault that would reveal itself at the worst possible moment. Owen mentally rehearsed every piece of lifting equipment in the cargo bay, imagining dozens of different extraction scenarios. Steve replayed his electronic countermeasures over and over, searching for flaws that refused to appear. Evelyn found herself thinking not about the mission, but about the countless civilizations that had spent generations living in fear of the Aethelguard. If 5 discarded humans could accomplish what entire governments had never dared attempt, perhaps the galaxy was not as powerless as it believed. Leo remained alone on the observation deck until the stars stretched into brilliant rivers of light. He remembered the day the military had stripped away his uniform. He remembered watching powerful officers congratulate themselves for following regulations while innocent civilians paid the price. For years he had believed that chapter of his life was over. Now, strangely enough, it felt as though everything that had happened since then, the dishonorable discharge, the years of scavenging forgotten battlefields, the broken ship, and the unlikely family he had found among society's outcasts, had been leading toward this single journey. Ahead of them, hidden somewhere beyond the endless darkness, the Aethelguard continued following its flawless schedule with absolute confidence. It had no living crew to grow suspicious, no admiral expecting the unexpected, no guard glancing nervously over a shoulder, only perfect machines executing perfect calculations. And that, Leo realized as the rust bucket raced toward destiny, might become the greatest weakness the Vrykul Directorate had ever built into the greatest weapon they had ever created. The hunt for the impossible had ended. The heist was about to begin.